So who did the reading for today? What are we talking about today? Another controversial topic, right? What are we discussing today? Anybody know? Come on, one of you have to know. What am I doing right now? Okay, now I'm not. Now I am. What am I doing right now? I'm speaking, right? We're talking about free speech today. That's right. Now this has become a more controversial topic, I would say, within the last few decades. Today we're going to be talking about free speech, prejudicial speech, more specifically, and how this connects to hate speech, and the different arguments for and against protecting prejudicial speech. You may not think there are any arguments for doing that, but as we'll go through the lecture today, I think you'll find that the thinker that we're looking at today thinks differently. So we're looking at a piece that was written by Jonathan Rauch. He is most famous probably for his book Kindly Inquisitors. But this is an essay that he wrote in which he tries to provide something of a defense of prejudicial speech and why prejudicial speech is actually necessary, and perhaps defending free speech is our best strategy if we actually want to reduce hate and prejudicial views in society. So it's kind of a counterintuitive argument, but I think you'll be able to follow it as we go along through it today. Rauch makes it clear in this piece that his goal is to defend people's right to incendiary speech and to provide arguments for allowing incendiary speech to exist. He's going to be arguing against censorship of different kinds of speech. What is incendiary speech? What does that word mean? You call something incendiary. What are you saying about it? We're not just talking about speech in general today. We're talking about a specific kind of speech. What is incendiary speech? Yeah. Well, yeah, what is incendiary speech? Not motivational. It kind of has the opposite view, or an opposite characteristic. What is it? When we talk about free speech and defending free speech, what kind of speech are we normally talking about when we have those discussions? What kind of speech is criticized, and what kind of speech do people want to censor?
Hate speech.
Hate speech, right? Prejudicial speech, explosive speech, speech that maybe offends other people. That's primarily what Jonathan Rauch is talking about when he says incendiary speech, is speech that offends other people. In this article, Rauch is concerned with providing arguments for allowing incendiary speech in the public and in our private lives, including hate speech, And he's also going to be talking about censorship and this social trend that he is seeing pervade society, which I would argue has only increased today, which he calls purism. We can see this article as kind of an exploration of the importance of speech in Western society and in the United States more specifically. And it might be helpful for you to know something about Jonathan Rauch as a person before we move forward. Jonathan Rauch is not some random, straight white guy talking about hate speech. He's actually a gay man who was born in the 1960s. And as he grew up during that time, he faced a lot of different kinds of prejudicial speech, surrounded by American culture, which was very hateful towards gays at that time. So he was living before gay people really got to experience the expansion of their own civil rights and their ability to marry one another. So he has personal experience with prejudicial speech, with hate speech. He's been the target of it many times. And yet he's still going to defend people's right to free speech, because he thinks that free speech not only is important for liberal democracies in general, for our society, but also allowing for free speech, defending free speech, is the best strategy that we can lean into if we want to change people's minds and we actually want to reduce hateful rhetoric in society. That's going to be his overall argument today. Now, he starts off this article by basically noticing this kind of social trend that he is seeing pervading American society. He says that it's becoming increasingly more common for people both on the right and the left to argue that there is no room for prejudicial speech or hate speech in society, and that all such forms of prejudicial speech or hate speech should be censored. Rauch sees this social trend as being motivated by what he calls purism. He says that purism has saturated American society, whose, quote, major tenet is that society cannot be just until the last traces of invidious prejudice have been scrubbed away. And I'm sure a lot of you have had experience with this view, and perhaps you hold this view yourself, that society is not going to be able to be just. Society is going to continue to be a hostile place for certain social groups as long as hateful speech exists, as long as discriminatory speech exists, as long as racist speech exists. I think he uses the word purism here to denote this idea that all kinds of offending speech must be scrubbed away in order for society to ultimately be just, in order to establish social justice. And this word purism conjures up for me kind of ideas of the Puritans. Does anybody know who the Puritans were in American history? The Puritans were a group of Christian thinkers who really railed against not so much speech, but against practices that they thought were unholy, they thought were disgusting. And so they really advocated strongly and zealously for their Christian beliefs and tried to convince people that not only were certain behaviors not good for society, but they would also engage in what you might call hateful or offensive speech, targeting these people and being discriminatory against certain kinds of social groups, such as gay people. The same kind of trend that the Puritans were latching onto, I think Rauch thinks a lot of contemporary Americans are kind of embodying themselves. This idea that the improper or the offensive or what we deem as disgusting must be swept away. It must be cleaned away. Now, the proponents of this view, who think that discourse structures our society so heavily that our society cannot be just until we fundamentally change the discourses that we use to engage with one another, Rauch says that their primary goal is eliminating racism, sexism, homophobia, and other forms of prejudice from society, and that this is actually a noble goal, right? These are well-intentioned people, but Rauch doesn't think that the censorship of speech is the way to get to a more ideal society. In fact, as we'll see, he thinks censorship of speech is actually counterproductive to these goals. But we'll get there in a moment. Now, before we actually get into his arguments as to why our primary goal should not be to eliminate these things, it might be helpful to define what hate speech is, since that's going to be central to our discussion today. What is hate speech? Can anybody provide a definition for me? What is hate speech? This is a term that you've heard a lot, right? Perhaps it's a term that you use when you're having conversations with others, when you're criticizing our society. What do you all think hate speech is? Would you be able to point out an example of hate speech if you saw it? What makes something hate speech?
It's usually like threatening or like abusive towards like a certain like group of people or like something about like a specific part of them.
Okay, so it has to do with a certain social group, right? It's a claim or it's an accusation leveled against a certain social group, right? Are there any other characteristics that are essential to hate speech? What do you think? I'm thinking of a certain D word. Say it louder.
Discrimination.
Right. It has to do with a social group. Hate speech normally has to do with a claim or an accusation made against a social group, a class of people. But it's a discriminatory remark, right? It's a remark that says something about a whole group or a whole class of people on the basis of one of their immutable characteristics, or on the basis of one of the features that they have that makes them a part of that social group, right? So it might be skin color. I don't know. It might be, you might not say class. Maybe you would say class falls into this. You can have classist speech. But it normally has to do with race, gender, ethnicity, sex, right? So I think probably a good definition of hate speech is discriminatory speech against a social group based on one or more of their immutable characteristics, or I don't want to say essential, but things like race, gender, sex, sexuality perhaps. Does this kind of fit in with your understanding of hate speech? Is there anything that's missing from that definition? I'm seriously wondering. This is kind of what I was taught when I was in school, so. Okay, before we jump into the arguments, let me ask you another question. Is there any reason we should allow hate speech in society? Or should we censor all speech that is hate speech? And then should we go further than that? Should we censor all speech that is offensive speech? What are your positions on this? I'd love to hear what you think about this issue. Yeah.
I mean, like, hate speech obviously is horrible to like most things, but I think that everybody like can have their own opinion. I think like the way that they go about it might not be good. Like I think that you can say really anything kind of respectful, I guess. Like you don't have to make it hate speech to have an opinion. I don't know. Like I feel like you can't just like you can't get rid of it. So then you're telling people that they can't think a certain way. That's not.
Okay, so you brought up a bunch of interesting things there. One of the things you said is that it's not moral, right? Hate speech is immoral, right? So there's an ethical aspect to speech. That's something that we're concerned about in this class. This is an ethics class, right? When we're talking about speech, what other kinds of conversations can we have about it besides the morality of it?
That what being said isn't true. Hate speech is just mainly full of facts that are just trying to put certain people down.
Okay, so we might wonder about the veracity of the speech, whether it is true or false. What else? Think about the rights that we have as inhabitants of the United States. Whenever you talk about speech or hate speech with someone, and let's say you're against hate speech and they're like, no, speech should be defended, what kind of claims do they make? besides the ethics, the ethical side of it. What are we guaranteed by the First Amendment? What does that have to do with?
The government. Speaking against the government is in the Constitution. People always say freedom of speech, so I can say a slur.
True. What is that whole domain? In contrast to the ethics of speech, we can also talk about what has to do with the government and law and maybe I'm looking for too specific a word. The legality of speech, right? We can talk about the legality of it. We can talk about whether or not it's moral, we can talk about whether or not it's true, and we can talk about whether or not it's legal, right? Now, a lot of people are going to say that hate speech is illegal in addition to being immoral. But we'll get there. I think it's important that we recognize that we can talk about speech in these different domains because the kinds of arguments that we might level for and against prejudicial speech are going to be different depending on the domain that we're speaking in. I don't think anybody in this room would say that hate speech is ethical, right? Does anybody here think that going around spouting hate speech is a moral thing to do? I don't see anybody raising their hands. Okay. But there might be other considerations for allowing that kind of speech that go beyond the domain of just ethics and morality. And that's primarily what Rauch is going to be giving us today. Is he's going to be giving us practical, social, political, and epistemological considerations for allowing certain kinds of speech and not trying to censor them. Let's walk through what Rauch has to say about hate speech, about prejudicial speech, and why he thinks it shouldn't be censored. Rauch disagrees with a lot of people who try to censor or think hate speech should be censored, in thinking that our primary goal should be to eliminate prejudice in society. Rauch thinks that this should not be our primary goal. For starters, and this is something that I don't know if he mentions near the beginning or the end of the article, but I think it would be helpful to put it first. Eliminating prejudice is not an achievable goal. It's not going to be possible, he thinks, for us to eliminate racism, homophobia, and sexism from society. That's an idealistic way of thinking, he thinks. We're not going to be able to eliminate prejudice. So already we're setting ourselves up for an unachievable goal if that is our goal. Terrible marker. Let me get a new one. I gotta buy new markers or something. But there's another issue with prejudice. And that is figuring out what prejudice actually is. It is hard to distinguish, he says, prejudice from non-prejudice. One of the examples he brings up is a case in which college students were being reprimanded for engaging in hate speech, but their hate speech was a product of a sincerely held belief that they actually had. If you have a sincerely held belief, does that count as prejudice? If I were to draw a swastika on the board, would that be an example of hate speech? Because that's also an ancient Hindu symbol, religious symbol. Without knowing what my intentions are, what my goals are, how would you know that's hate speech if I drew that on the board? It's not always easy to distinguish prejudice from non-prejudice. And in fact, Rauch is going to argue that the people who do engage in hateful language, who do engage in hate speech, most of them are not the kind of people that wake up in the morning wanting to hate people, but they engage in hateful speech because they have some sincerely held belief about something that they're seeing in society that they think is bad, or something that they don't think should be allowed. So a lot of the people who are engaging in hateful forms of speech, he's going to be charitable. He's going to say a lot of them actually have good intentions. They're not bad people. It's that they have mistaken views about social groups. And they have mistaken views about what social groups are and are not doing in society. And furthermore, the way that we get rid of those mistaken views is not by censoring speech. That actually is a counterproductive strategy for engaging with this kind of speech. He thinks that censorship is counterproductive because if you look at how civil rights have been expanded in the United States, it is free speech that has allowed minority groups to make their voices heard and for attitudes to change. Rauch notes, I don't know if he notes it in this essay, but he notes it in some of the other talks that he gives, that if gays during the 1960s and 70s were to advocate for hate speech laws, that would not have turned out well for them because the hate speech laws would have been applied to them because they were being hateful of the American government, of the American people. Instead, the winning strategy when it comes to civil rights, historically, Rauch notes, seems to be allowing for all kinds of speech and allowing for public criticism of views and attitudes, because it's allowing for public criticism that actually changes people's minds and changes people's views, not censoring speech. And there's another reason why he thinks censorship is counterproductive. If you have someone who is engaging in hate speech, who is saying hateful things, in one talk I was listening to last night and this morning, as I was preparing this lecture, Rauch brought up the example of Milo Yiannopoulos. And he said, look, this guy is engaging in a lot of hate speech. He even said at one point he's never had an original thought, which I thought was kind of funny. But he ends up saying, look at what happened to Milo Yiannopoulos when people started leveling accusations of hate speech against him and tried to reprimand him for it. His fame skyrocketed. Making martyrs out of people who engage in hate speech actually causes them to become more popular, and it doesn't change people's minds. It raises the fame, it raises the notoriety of people who engage in hate speech by trying to censor them. It doesn't actually help the cause of reducing prejudice to censor speech. The winning strategy, he says, is subjecting people's views and ideas to public criticism, allowing them to speak so that their silly or mistaken views can be criticized, not by not allowing them to speak. Related to this point is a point that I alluded to a little bit earlier, which is the idea that eliminating prejudice involves eliminating what he calls dissent and pluralism, having a wide range of views in society, in the public square. Pluralism and dissent, Rauch thinks, are necessary political tools for the minority. And what you end up doing when you end up censoring speech is you end up making the society homogenous in what they think and what they believe. And that this doesn't allow for oppressed minority groups to have their voices be heard. He talks about this on pages 2 and 3 in this essay, which I'm going to read in just a moment here. To read from the essay, he says, at the last paragraph on page 2, going into page 3, the sweeping implications of this challenge to pluralism are not, I think, well enough understood by the public at large. Indeed, the new brand of totalism has yet to even be properly named. Multiculturalism, for instance, is much too broad. Political correctness comes closer, but is too trendy and snide. For lack of anything else, I will call the new anti-pluralism purism, since its major tenet is that society cannot be just until the last traces of invidious prejudice have been scrubbed away. Whatever you call it, the purist way of seeing things has spread through American intellectual life with remarkable speed, so much so that many people will blink at you uncomprehendingly or even call you a racist or sexist or homophobe, etc., if you suggest that expressions of racism should be tolerated or that prejudice has its part to play. What is especially dismaying is that the purists pursue prejudice in the name of protecting minorities. In order to protect people like me, he's speaking of himself, a homosexual, they must pursue people like me, dissidents. In order to bolster minority self-esteem, they suppress minority opinion. There are, of course, all kinds of practical and legal problems with the purist campaign, the incursions against the First Amendment, the inevitable abuses by prosecutors and activists who define as hateful and violent whatever speech they dislike or can score points off of, the lack of any evidence that repressing prejudice eliminates it rather than inflames it. But minorities of all people ought to remember that by definition we cannot prevail by numbers. And we generally cannot prevail by force. Against the power of ignorant mass opinion and group prejudice and superstition, we only have our voices. If you doubt that minorities' voices are powerful weapons, think of the lengths to which Southern officials went to silence the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. Think of how much gay people have improved their lot over 25 years simply by refusing to remain silent. Recall the Michigan student who was prosecuted for saying that homosexuality is a treatable disease. And notice that he was black. Under that Michigan speech code, more than 20 blacks were charged with racist speech, while no instance of racist speech by whites was punished. In Florida, the hate speech law was invoked against a black man who called a policeman a white cracker. Not so surprisingly, in the first hate crimes case to reach the Supreme Court, the victim was white and the defendant was black. In the escalating war against prejudice, the right is already learning to play by the rules that were pioneered by the purist activists of the left. Last year, leading Democrats, including the president, criticized the Republican Party for being increasingly in the thrall of the Christian right. Some of the rhetoric was harsh, fire-breathing Christian radical right. But it wasn't vicious or even clearly wrong. Never mind. When Democratic Representative Vic Fazio said Republicans were, quote, being forced to the fringes by the aggressive political tactics of the religious right, the chairman of the Republican National Committee, Haley Barbour, said, quote, Christian bashing was the left's preferred form of religious bigotry. Bigotry, prejudice, quote, Christians active in politics are now on the receiving end of an extraordinary campaign of bias and prejudice, unquote, said the conservative leader William J. Bennett. One discerns here where the new purism leads. Eventually, any criticism of any group will be labeled as prejudice. And so Rauch is worrying here that this new trend, embodying this idea that we need to eliminate hateful speech or prejudicial speech, is going to end up biting people in the butt, and it's going to end up actually hurting minorities than it is going to help them. He thinks that censorship is actually counterproductive, and that by engaging in censorship, we are taking away one of the primary political tools that minorities have to advocate for the betterment of their own lives, to advocate for a more just society. Fifth, Rauch thinks that it is mistaken and silly to characterize words as violence. He says the purists are wrong to claim that words are violence, and he says that punishing discourse is time that is ill spent compared to actually changing the conditions of our society. Going around punishing people for their speech isn't helping things, but actually volunteering or advocating for better socioeconomic policy would be a much better use of your time. He talks about this on page 4. Starting with the paragraph, the fear engendered. The fear engendered by hateful speech is real. The remedy is as clear and as imperfect as ever to protect citizens against violence. This, I grant, is something that American society has never done very well and now does quite poorly. It is no solution to define words as violence or prejudice as oppression, and then by cracking down on words or thoughts, pretend that we are doing something about violence and oppression. No doubt it is easier to pass a speech code or hate crimes law and proclaim the streets safer than actually making the streets safer. But the one must never be confused with the other. Every cop or prosecutor chasing words is one fewer chasing criminals. In a world rife with real violence and oppression, full of Rwandas and Bosnias, where people are getting killed and enslaved, and 11-year-olds spraying bullets at children in Chicago and in turn being executed by gang lords, it is odious of Toni Morrison to say that words are violence. Indeed, equating verbal violence with physical violence is a treacherous, mischievous business. Not long ago, a writer was charged with viciously and gratuitously wounding the feelings and dignity of millions of people. He was charged, in effect, with exhibiting flagrant prejudice against Muslims and outrageously slandering their beliefs. What is freedom of expression, mused Salman Rushdie, a year after the Ayatollah sentenced him to death and put a price on his head. Quote, without the freedom to offend, it ceases to exist, unquote. I can think of nothing sadder than that minority activists, in their haste to make the world better, should be the ones to forget the lesson of Rushdie's plight. For minorities, pluralism, not purism, is the answer. The campaigns to eradicate prejudice, all of them, the speech codes and workplace restrictions and mandatory therapy for accused bigots and all the rest, should stop now. The whole objective of eradicating prejudice, as opposed to correcting it and criticizing it, should be repudiated as a fool's errand. Salman Rushdie was right. Toni Morrison is wrong, and minorities belong at his side, not theirs. Perhaps one of the strongest arguments that he gives involve the consequences of putting hate speech laws into legislation. And this is something that a lot of people don't think about. Censorship, if we're to pass hate speech laws, involves the creation of political tools which can be abused. And not just abused in general. But if you're for passing hate speech laws, Rauch thinks, you should reflect deeply on how that political tool and how those laws could be used in the future when power shifts hands. The thought experiment, Rauch thinks, that you should run in your head when trying to determine if we should pass hate speech laws is, would I want to pass this law if I knew that my mortal enemy was going to be in political power the next election cycle? I mean, think about that for a second. For those of you who hate Donald Trump, let's imagine that we pass hate speech laws because Democrats are in power right now, but then Trump gets reelected the next election cycle. Can you imagine those hate speech laws being abused? Being used to target minorities? Being used to target black people who say things on Twitter like white people are crackers? You could see how this political tool could be abused, right? It's a worrying thing. And so he thinks that censorship involves the creation of political tools which can be abused and can be retroactively applied to minorities if somebody else gets in power. And we don't want that. That's not a road that we want to go down. And finally, and this argument isn't actually in this essay, but it's an argument that he gave in an interview that I was watching last night to prepare for this lecture. He actually writes about this argument in his book, Kindly Inquisitors, where he talks about the concept of liberal science. Rauch makes a pretty strong argument in that book, which is inspired by the American philosopher Charles Sanders Peirce. Peirce asked in his philosophy, where does our knowledge come from? And how do we know when we've grasped what the truth is? What process do we use to come to the truth? A lot of people think it's just science. And what I mean by that is experimentation. People find the truth by engaging in experiments, testing hypotheses, and reporting the results. But that is only one small part of how we as a society learn what's true. The most important part to that process is not the experimentation. It's putting the data out into the public sphere so that it can be criticized and so that it can be tested by other people. We need to be able to have social dialogues about the ideas and the views and the hypotheses that we have, because that's the only way to allow the cream, the truth, to rise to the top. If we start censoring speech, that is only going to hamper our ability to understand the world in a more holistic way. The example that Rauch brings up in the interview is he says, there's no difference fundamentally, from an outside point of view, between Einstein and a raving madman both scribbling equations on a wall if none of their views were ever put into the public sphere. Nobody would be able to know who is true or who is not true. the raving lunatic, whether they have the right equations or whether Einstein has the right equations and the right view of how gravity in our universe works. It wasn't until those views were put into the public sphere so that they could be examined and tested and criticized that we even had a revolution in science in the 20th century, thanks to Einstein's field equations. So censoring speech involves putting up an obstacle in the very process that we use to determine what's true in our society. Free speech, he thinks, is necessary for coming to the truth and for science to deliver practical and useful results. And so to sum up, Rauch thinks that eliminating prejudice from society is not an obtainable goal. Censorship is actually counterproductive in reducing prejudice in society because it bolsters the fame of people who engage in hate speech when we try to cancel them. And that free speech generally is necessary to continue cultivating a more holistic understanding of the world around us. Words, he says, are not violence, and they should not be confused with the physical violence that people actually face living in bad socioeconomic situations, unjust ones. And that censorship, if we were to engage in censorship legally, what that would end up doing is creating political tools that can be abused. And because we never know who's going to be in power next, that's a very dangerous thing to do, especially to minorities. Instead, free speech should be defended. Prejudicial speech even should be offended. Because eventually, by allowing that speech in the public sphere, it will become clear over time who has mistaken views and who doesn't. And the mistaken views will be filtered out of society, and the true views will rise to the top. The views that aren't bigoted. All right. That's his spiel. What do you all think about his arguments here? Do you think he's right? Do you think he's wrong? Is there things you like, things you dislike?
With him saying that we should take away free speech but let the public decide or judge it, I think that makes sense. Instead of because when you take it away, it kind of gives people, or some people, an underdog feeling about it. I don't know,
are you saying that censorship actually increases social tension?
I guess, yeah.
Maybe?
It's just, it makes sense for the public to judge and then really listen to what the person is saying and then make their opinion about it instead of just completely wiping it away.
Okay. What do the rest of y'all think? You totally on board? You're like, yeah, Rauch is totally right here. Everything he says is correct. Or do you have problems with it? Exercise your free speech in this room. Please. I would ask that you be respectful while doing it, but... What do y'all personally believe? Yeah.
So I agree with him when he says it's hard to distinguish between if it's prejudice or non-prejudice because personally I'm bisexual and I make gay jokes because they are kind of funny to me, but not like towards anybody, but like about myself, like just like
Kind of like
little things,
self-deprecating
yeah,
stuff,
just,
or
like nothing crazy, but like just like little jokes. So like, if I get thrown in jail for making jokes about myself, like when I am like bisexual, like that's like that. I feel like that's like, to me, like it's not like a huge thing for me, but I know it is for a lot of people. I feel like it's just based on like what you deem is wrong and what you don't.
well, that's another important point. There's not a one-size-fits-all rule to determine what's going to offend something and what doesn't. Right? On a Tuesday, you might be offended by a claim, and then on Wednesday, you might not be offended by it. The same claim. But even more importantly, people find different things offensive. Right? One of the points that Rauch makes in one of the several interviews that he's given on this topic is that by censoring speech, you prevent people from listening to the things that they want to listen to, like speakers on a college campus. He thinks that that's kind of wrong, taking away people's opportunity to listen to the speakers that they want to listen to, because people boycott the speaker for hate speech. What do you think about that? After all, the people who are boycotting it, he thinks, they don't have to go to the speech. They don't have to listen to it. But they're preventing other people from having that opportunity, so he thinks it's wrong. You agree with him on that? Y'all are fine with hate speech? We should defend it? Are y'all completely on board with that? Y'all agreed not too long ago that hate speech is immoral, right? But we should still defend it because of these practical and perhaps legal concerns? Yeah.
I think it's interesting because in our art history classes, there's a lot of like nudes and a lot of things that are offensive to people just because that's art in the past. And there have been students that have complained to the dean about the art that our professor is showing us, and therefore she gets censored. So she has to rearrange her lectures to accommodate for kids who aren't, comfortable looking at female nudes, male nudes, sculpture, different things like that. And it's like, that takes away from our education, from our learning. So it's like interesting in the sense of like a student's hate speech towards art history has made the professor censored, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. I wonder are they actually engaging in hate speech, the people who bring up these complaints, though?
Yes, they are, because they're not taking into account the culture, where it comes from. And nudes were praised. They were like idolized. And they're sitting there like, oh, well, I don't want to see a man that's nude. It's inappropriate. This is a Catholic school. I came to a Catholic school for a reason. And it's like, this is education. If you don't want to take the class, don't take the class. But you don't have to sit here and degrade the art from the past.
Okay. That kind of feeds into a claim that a lot of people make against hate speech, which is, and let me know if y'all vibe with this. It's not just that hate speech is offensive, but that it creates a hostile environment where people can't participate in society with the same freedom that others do. Within critical theory, within more progressive views, they're going to say things like the discourses that we use create hostile and oppressive environments that prevent people, minorities usually, from engaging in full political and social participation. Do y'all accept that? Do you buy that? There's been a rise on college campuses in the production of safe spaces, right, to combat this issue. Places where students can go where they don't have to listen to the speech of others, right, where they don't have to interact with people sometimes of a race that they don't want to interact with. How do we feel about those spaces? I know you all have opinions. You're just afraid to share them. Are you afraid of offending someone, or are you afraid of being criticized? Maybe both. I'll wait. We can sit in silence as long as it takes. Yes.
I think we should listen to perspective with Kanye's anti-Semitic quote and how Adidas dropped him. I feel like that would be an interesting conversation to have.
Okay. I'm not familiar with the quote. Will you, maybe if there's a bad word in there, you don't have to say it, but what did he say? I did hear that Adidas dropped him, though. But I didn't.
Like, he's no longer a billionaire no more. Like, he was dropped off the Forbes list and everything.
For this comment that he made?
Yeah, it wasn't, he was talking very anti-Semitic.
Very.
Okay. Yeah, does anybody know what he said?
Why is no one quoting it?
I think he was on like a spree of like just saying a bunch of stuff, and then he was like,
Where was he saying this?
Twitter.
Oh, okay. So he was tweeting out some stuff.
And then he was like,
Twitter's a very hateful place, right? Fits right in with everything else on there. You look up, cute pictures of dogs. You hear a woman talk about how she gets to have coffee with her husband in the morning in their garden for hours and talk and how great it is, and people just criticize them endlessly. It's like, really? You're just living for criticizing people? Come on. Got something better to do with your time? Let people have their coffee.
He said that he would go DEFCON 3 on Jewish people.
Okay.
I guess he was on like a spree of like saying a bunch of things.
So it was like a
He was
bunch
like,
of tweets?
You guys are next or whatever.
Okay.
Because he's like referencing something else, but I don't really know what he's talking about.
So do people think this is like a call to violence? Is that why he got dropped from Adidas?
Maybe he's just an asshole.
That could be it too, yeah.
Oh, and he said, the funny thing is, I actually can't be anti-Semitic because black people are actually Jew also. You guys have toyed with me and tried to blackball anyone who ever opposes your agenda.
Okay.
This was immediately after saying that he's going DEFCON 3 on Jewish people.
What does that mean? It doesn't.
It sounds not good.
It doesn't sound good. Is it hate speech? It is discriminatory towards a social group, right?
It kind of sounds like a threat, to be honest, the more hate speech.
It sounds like a threat.
Yeah.
Okay. So that speech does not seem moral. Right? At least it doesn't seem nice and loving, right? Is that speech protected under U.S. law, though? Should it be protected under U.S. law?
Technically, it's not protected under U.S. law. Under the First Amendment, there are exceptions to freedom of speech. You cannot use threats. You cannot do defamation of character.
Slander, right?
Slander, obscenity. You just can't threaten people's lives and think that you're just protected under the First Amendment, because that is not how it works. There's a reason there's exceptions to these rights, and things like that are those reasons.
Right. It wouldn't be good if we had a bunch of people going around threatening people's lives, right? Or threatening people's families. That would not be good. So it does kind of sound like what he was saying was a threat, right? Maybe you could say it's even slander, or it's defamatory. But although he doesn't seem like he's talking about one person, so maybe that case is harder to make, right? Normally, defamation suits are like a person versus a person.
I mean, you can look at the Alex Jones case with the Sandy Hook Elementary. He was spreading a lot of rumors saying that it was false, it didn't happen, that it was a political agenda against Democrats, and he ended up getting taken to court for that and lost the lawsuit and had to pay a shit ton of money for it. So.
Right. Right. So should we accept that kind of speech? What do you think? Is offending someone, psychologically harming someone, can those kind of objections be sidelined because these considerations are more important? We can recognize that speech harms people, but maybe you still might think, well, it still should be protected for these reasons. Is that what y'all believe? Yeah.
I feel like it shouldn't be illegal at a federal level, because that, he's right. It would be turned around and people would be arrested for calling white people crackers. It would just be a whole thing. But I think that people should just shut up. I think that the world would be so much better if people knew when to talk.
I can agree with that. They say silence is golden, right? In our age of social media, everybody is talking endlessly about everything all the time, right? Here's what I made for dinner. You take a picture. I hate you. You suck. The Cowboys are the worst. Whatever it is. Do we need to be talking this much? Do we need to be expressing ourselves in these ways? Do they add anything to society? Yeah?
Yeah. You gotta know what's going on in people's lives.
Do you need to know what people have for dinner?
Sometimes. Maybe I want to make some delicious meal.
Maybe you're like, look, I want to follow these recipe blogs. I want to follow these people on TikTok that are doing their recipes. What I ate, after gastric bypass, day 137. Right? I don't have Twitter, but my girlfriend, or TikTok, but my girlfriend's always trying to show me TikToks. What do we think about hateful speech, though? We can agree that it's offensive and that it's harmful, right?
I feel like if it were to have been censored, he would still have that contract. He would still have that deal with Adidas, because it wouldn't have gone out, and nobody would have known.
Oh, so in a sense, allowing for free speech has kind of showed Kanye's true colors, and that's actually a good thing for people to know what he's like if you think this is reflective of his character. Okay. This is kind of the idea that we were getting back to, right? Which is kind of this one, right? All speech is revelatory in some sense. They reveal something about the person speaking it. Maybe we do want to know that stuff. censoring does get in the way of that, right? What were you going to say?
I have no idea.
Okay, that's all right. I lose my train of thought all the time. Another thing you might worry about is censoring speech ends up having a particular effect on people's thoughts. This is what Orwell explores in his book 1984, right? People who don't have access to certain speech, certain words, don't have access to certain concepts. And it changes how people think. They end up losing access to certain perspectives on life, even certain emotions in that book, because people don't really know what it means to be happy. They don't really know what it means to have a free thought. And so they're kind of shoveled, they're conditioned into a certain way of seeing and experiencing the world because of their lack of access to language and concepts. What do you think about that idea? Maybe you're thinking, oh, generally that's true, but I don't see any problem with censoring hate speech. Like, why do people need access to those concepts and words, right? Yeah.
Isn't that like Elon Musk trying to buy Twitter because he thinks the world is a simulation and he's trying to crack the simulation?
I mean, he does believe we're in a simulation, yeah. I don't know what his reasons for buying Twitter are.
I
You know,
think it's for
maybe he's
censorship.
just trying to say F you to a bunch
Yeah,
of
it's for
people.
censorship, to take it down.
Okay. Is that a good thing?
I mean, okay. So, for me, I'm Hispanic, and like there has been times when I've been called certain slurs like a spick, and not only that, I am a lesbian, so people have called me certain things once they find out like who I am. So for me, it's like a little bit different. But in terms of like, I don't think hate speech should be illegal, but I will say I feel like certain college campuses and certain social media platforms should be able to choose whether or not they want to censor that. Personally, for me, for my well-being and my mental health, I would prefer like to set them to censor certain stuff. But again, like that's their choice. I can like have the choice to like not use Twitter, not use like social media at all, or not go to weird rallies that tell me I'm a homosexual and I should burn in hell. But like, I don't know.
Yeah. No, I get that. I mean, Rauch is not denying that words can be harmful to people, and then they can take a real effect. They can take a real toll on people. But what he's worried about is coming down too hard on that kind of speech ends up being counterproductive in our goals of reducing prejudice. Because then those ideas, if they're not allowed in the public square, he thinks, they're not going to be criticized. People are just going to hold on to their beliefs and their bigoted views. Actually, if you wanted people to get to change their bigoted views, you let them speak, and then you show where they're going wrong. And that ends up producing more of a transformation than preventing people from saying the things that they're thinking. Do you buy that argument? Do you think censorship is actually counterproductive to reducing prejudice in society?
Well, like, I know somebody who went to college for like cybersecurity, and he got a job with Facebook, and he works as like the Facebook police, he calls himself. So he like censors stuff that like comes through and is flagged by like the system. And I was like, oh, like how do you decide what you actually like do like censor, and then you put these people in like a 30-day like period where they can't post anything and they can't do anything. And he's like, well, a lot of the time, like if I just don't agree with it, like my political views, like if I don't agree with them and I think that like sounds stupid, I just like censor it and like don't let them post anything. I was like, but that's like kind of like counterproductive to the idea of like censoring. Like my understanding of censoring was always like to keep dangerous stuff off of the internet, but somebody sharing like their political idea or like a view that they have shouldn't be taken down just because like this singular person doesn't agree with it.
Okay. So sometimes there's arbitrary enforcement of censorship that you don't agree with?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, does anybody have any final comments, questions on this issue? It's an important issue, especially on college campuses. Right? And I think it's an issue that you should really think a lot about. Because it's not an easy one to navigate, I don't think. There are a lot of considerations here. Okay. All right, well, thank you for coming. I will see you on Tuesday. Have a great weekend, everybody.